December time, we had the occasion that this museum was recognized in legislation as the United States National Atomic Museum. We're very, very pleased about that, and very pleased that on this day, 125 years ago, was the anniversary of Madame Curie's birth. And people would say, well, it's not the 7th, it's only the 6th here. But it is November the 7th in Poland. We have a very fine program, I think, for you this morning. And I want to welcome all our guests, and we're going to have them introduced. You're going to hear from them. But the first person I'd like to introduce is a person who has been a real supporter of the museum and of our Department of Energy. Congressman Steve Schiff was instrumental on the House side in seeing that legislation I mentioned was passed last year. And we want to tell him we thank you very much for that, Congressman. He has just finished his campaign, and he's going back to Congress, and not a few congressmen can't say that, I suppose.
There were a few casualties.
But we do want to welcome you all, and Congressman, I'd like to ask you to join us and say a few words.
Well, I promise to be brief because I see how many people are lined up to address you, many more qualified within these walls than I. I do have something to say, but I can't resist first sharing one anecdote from the campaign trail. I won't even mention the political party because it's really not relevant, but in one district there was a huge fight going on between two candidates for the House of Representatives, and all of a sudden one candidate stopped television advertising. And his national party found out about it, and one of the national party officials called him from Washington and said, "Why did you stop your TV advertising? You're doing so well." And the candidate said, "Well, I stopped because I ran out of money." And his party official said, "Listen, anyone who'd stop spending just because they ran out of money doesn't belong in Congress in the first place." I want to say that this exhibit means a great deal to me because, first of all, my belief is and always has been and will be, as long as I'm able to pronounce it, that human initiative and devotion to science will lead to the solution to all of our problems, and particularly in the case of Madame Curie, the evidence that it does not matter who you are, it doesn't matter your gender, it doesn't matter your religion, it doesn't matter your national origin, none of that counts. There are exceptional human beings in the world, and these people, if given the opportunity to perform, will by themselves bring us the results we need. Finally, I have to tell you that I'm not above admitting that I still have things to learn. I've got to say that until I walked into this room and saw the Polish flag next to the French flag, I had no idea that Madame Curie is in fact Polish by origin. I just assumed that both Mr. Curie and Madame Curie were French nationals, and didn't know any different. Never saw that in any of the history books. And that's a very, very important source of pride to me, because the Schiff family comes from Russian-occupied Poland, right near where Madame Curie came from. So I'm not only glad to be at this exhibit, I'm glad to have learned what I just learned today, and congratulate the Savinskys for helping put this exhibit together. Thank you for having me very, very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for being here. Another important element of progress in seeing our museum develop into national stature is the formation of the Museum Foundation. And that foundation has been in place since September, and there are a number of very, very outstanding people working on that foundation to help bring this museum to the kind of place that we all want it to be in. And so I'd like to ask that we have a number of the trustees here this morning, and I'd like to ask all the museum trustees to please stand if they would, so we could recognize them. Would the trustees that are here please stand? We have two of our own guests here. Good. Well, thank you very much. Part of a museum it's a requisite to have a dedicated staff, and I think we do have that here at the museum. And Joni Heslop, our museum director, and her staff just do an outstanding job. They do a lot with very little, and we're trying to change some of that and provide some additional resources for them, but they have done an outstanding job in putting this exhibit together. I think you will agree with me when you have a chance to look at it if you haven't. But Joni, I'd like to say thank you for the job you're doing, and I'd like to ask you to read a proclamation from the governor.
Thank you, Mr. Culpepper. Thank you. We have a letter that was written to one of my wonderful trustees, Jacek, well, actually two of them, Jacek and Christina Shivinsky. And the letter from the governor reads as follows. Thank you for the invitation to join you on Friday, November 6th, for the dedication of a permanent exhibit honoring Maria Skłodowska, I knew I'd blow it, folks, I'm sorry, Curie, on the anniversary of her 125th birthday. Scheduling conflicts prevent my attendance, but you will be in my thoughts. I know I would enjoy the opportunity to renew my appreciation and admiration for Madame Curie's remarkable accomplishments and contributions to the scientific world. It is with great pleasure that Mrs. King and I welcome your visitors from Poland and France for the opening of this exhibition. Our special wish is that our visitors from France and Poland will enjoy our state of New Mexico, America's land of enchantment, and our warm and gracious people. The state of New Mexico is very proud of the National Atomic Museum and the new exhibit, Madame Curie, Woman of Science. The exhibit is an opportunity to honor this great woman and to educate our citizens as well as visitors on her unique contributions to the world in the area of science and medicine through her investigation of radioactivity. Mrs. King and I send you our warmest best wishes for a very successful dedication and for a spectacular exhibition. We look forward to spectacular reviews of this momentous occasion. And I promise my Polish friends I'll do better on the rest of the, hopefully, on the rest of the names. Okay. We now are going to hear from a representative of the mayor's office, Mr. Kevin Murphy.
Thank you very much, Joni. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I was remarking to Joni that I had come over to this facility about 15 years ago to see what the National Atomic Museum was all about, and it is absolutely astounding to see what it is today. With the support of DOE and Sandia and others, this facility is truly a world-class set of expositions and has a bright future ahead of it for tourism for the local area, and also remembering the contributions, the international contributions that have been made to science and technology. On behalf of Mayor Luis Saavedra and the City of Albuquerque, I welcome you here today. This is doubly significant for me because I am an executive on loan from Sandia National Laboratories to the city, working as the Economic Development Officer. So I have been right across the street for many years working away and watched this facility develop. The other significance that this has for me is that my family and I have been very pleased to have a Polish visitor living with us in Albuquerque, and she's sitting right over here. This is Katarzyna Jezierska, who's from Poland, and she's going to the University of New Mexico. I'd like her to stand up if that wouldn't be an embarrassment. She has been a real pleasure to have in our household. I've learned a lot about Poland. I've learned very little about the Polish language. I find it very difficult. And anyway, I'd like to welcome you here today, and it's a real pleasure for me to participate in this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Now, you'll learn if you know me at all that all my trustees are very special. But I want to introduce two that are certainly most special, and that's Christina and Jacek Shivinsky. Christina and Jacek served as guest curators. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, shall I start over again? I'd like to introduce two very special trustees, Christina and Jacek Shivinsky. Christina and Jacek served as guest curators for the Madame Curie exhibit, and they provided so much assistance that I can't begin to tell you. We could not have done it without them. They have an interesting background and certainly are well qualified to serve as curators for this particular exhibit. Christina is a native of Poland, and she worked with the Technical Military Academy, specializing in radiation protection. She was an adjunct professor for the Institute of Nuclear Research and the chief specialist in the Polish National Atomic Energy from 1981 to 1986. Her husband, Jacek, is a radiation biology expert and was an engineer with Sandia National Laboratories. He was also involved in irradiation technology projects with the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The Shevensky's, we Americanize it and we say Shevensky's, but it's the Shevensky's, will read a letter from Madame Curie's daughter, Eva Curie Labouisse.
Thank you, Joni. Ava, the daughter, sends her deepest regrets that she cannot come. She is very elderly, but a still very active woman, writing and taking care of things that have to do with her mother. So she sent a letter to be read for her, and here's what she would like to tell you about her mother. And I quote, "My mother, Marie Curie, already belongs to a distant past. She was born 125 years ago, and that's today. She died 58 years ago. When she was growing up, her country, Poland, did not appear on any map, and her native town, Warsaw, was under the rule of the Tsar of Russia. As a teenager, Maria Skłodowska won prizes of excellence at her high school, but it seemed that was as far as she could go. In Warsaw in the early 1980s, women were not admitted to the university. There was no higher education for women. Well, as we all know, this is the very same girl who patiently earned the money to purchase a third-class railway ticket to France, and who made her way to the Sorbonne, to the wonderland of university classrooms and laboratories. In Paris, she lived in an unheated garret and survived mostly on bread and tea. She brilliantly won master's degrees in physics and mathematics. Then she engaged in independent research. She also married an eminent French scientist. With her husband, Pierre Curie, this young woman of 30 made an astonishing discovery which opened entirely new vistas to science and indirectly led into the nuclear age. After her husband's tragic death, Marie was made a university professor, the first woman to be appointed to a chair in higher education in France. During her career, she was awarded 2 Nobel Prizes, one in physics, shared with Pierre Curie and Henri Becquerel, another in chemistry, awarded to her alone. She received 24 other scientific prizes and medals, and 104 honorary memberships and degrees from institutions around the world. She was possibly by then the most famous woman of her time. The driving force which enabled Marie Curie to get to the top of the scientific world was not at all ambition. It was her burning intellectual curiosity and her passion for research. A passion as fervent as the love of music and a great musician. Speaking at an international conference in 1933, she said, and I quote, "I am among those who think that science has great beauty. A scientist in his laboratory is not only a technician, he is also a child, placed before natural phenomena which impress him like a fairy tale." In sending my best wishes of success to the organizers of the National Atomic Museum exhibit, I pray that Marie Curie's example will continue to encourage many young women and men of the coming generation to dedicate their lives to pure scientific research, which is one of the best and noblest ways to serve human progress. Eve Curie Labouisse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacek. I had a real treat last evening. I got to eat dinner with most of our speakers. And the first one I'm going to introduce is just a very exciting young lady, I will say. Her name is Mrs. Theodora Abel, or Teo, as I've come to call her, and as she prefers to be called. Theo is a longtime friend of Madame Curie's, or was a longtime friend of Madame Curie's. Mrs. Abel obtained her BA from Vassar in 1921 and her MA in psychology from Columbia University in 1924. She obtained her PhD in psychology from the University of Columbia in 1924. She was the director of psychology, postgraduate center for mental health in New York City for 23 years. Since 1972, she has been a clinical professor, Department of Psychiatry, University of New Mexico. Although she is very young, 93, she is an avid world traveler teaching family therapy to a worldwide audience. Would you please join me in welcoming to the podium, Theo.
Do you hear me all right? No? Do you hear me now? Wonder why. How is that? Is that better? Okay. So raise your hand if you don't hear me, all right? Do you want to fix something?
Try it now.
Is that all right now? All right. Okay. I'll tell you, I got to know Madame Curie. In 1920, Mrs. William Maloney, who was the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, was in Paris, and she met Marie Curie. Madame Curie told her that she needed another gram of radium. She had only one, which was being used for medical purposes. She wanted one for research. So Mrs. Maloney came back to America, and she talked to my mother. She and my mother were always raising money. I'd never been able to raise 10 cents, but my mother and Mrs. Maloney raised $100,000 from the women of America to buy a gram of radium for Madame Curie from the Belgian Congo, which is now Zaire. And Madame Curie came to this country to receive the $100,000 from President Harding. And when she was here, she came up to Vassar, where I was in college, to talk to the physics department. I didn't understand a word of the speech because I majored in psychology. Now, when she was at Vassar, Madame Curie said she wanted to see the dress parade at West Point. And so I called up West Point, and General MacArthur was then the superintendent. He was away, but his mother said she'd arranged a dress parade, which was against... She always bossed him, you know. Anyway, it was against the rules, but there was a dress parade, and we went to see it. And then later, then we went to Washington, and could I have a little water? I'm sorry, I have a little something. We went to Washington, and President Harding presented Marie Curie with $100,000. Then in 1922-23, I studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. I took one graduate year there. And since I'd met Madame Curie, I went to her laboratory, and then she invited me to her house quite a few times. I played the violin, and so her daughter Eve played the piano, and so we would play sonatas. And then Madame Curie would talk to us for supper, at supper time. She usually talked about French literature. It's very interesting. And then during that year, Madame Curie said she'd like to have a gram of radium for the Radium Institute in Warsaw, which had been founded. And her sister, Dr. Dwuska, was running it. So I told her I'd get her. By then, it was $50,000 for a gram. So I told her I'd get it. Of course, I couldn't raise any money. But I went back to America. I spoke to Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney said, give me 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, she had the $50,000. She had asked 5 people, including John D. Rockefeller Jr., to give $10,000 each. I forget the names of the others. So she got her gram of radium. And so I really had a very pleasant year with her there. That's enough.
Thank you, detail. That was really interesting. She told us a lot more stories last night at dinner, but you folks missed it. We're sorry. She's very fascinating. Another wonderful speaker that we have is our next guest, Mr. Bertrand de Galassus. I got that one right, didn't I? Thank you. Great. Okay. He's the nuclear attaché for energy affairs at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. Mr. de Galassus has a law degree and master's degree in economics. He has held numerous positions in the French Atomic Energy Commission, with particular emphasis in international affairs. Prior to his present position, he was deputy to the Director for International Affairs at the French Atomic Energy Commission. Would you give Mr. de Galassus a warm welcome? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the Embassy of France, which I represent here as its nuclear attaché, is of course very pleased to have been invited to the dedication of the magnificent exhibit you will visit later on. Let me tell you that Marie Curie was a woman of exception, and I will tell you why. First, as you were told, she was born in Poland in 1867, and she became French when she married Pierre Curie in 1985. 125 years after, she deserves universal admiration and respect, and she is as actual as ever. And this admiration and respect, she deserves them as a woman as well as a scientist. Marie Curie cannot be dissociated from her husband, Pierre. In France, when we ask people in the street about the great scientists they know, most of them answer Pierre et Marie Curie. Pierre et Marie in one single word, one single first name. And I commend Johnny, Mr. Sebensky, Mrs. Sebensky, and everybody who worked for this exhibit, because Pierre and Marie are not dissociated. Marie Curie is widely recognized as a great lady dedicated to science. She lives forever in the memory of those who were lucky enough to work with her in her incredible labs of the Paris Radium Institute, and before that at the Paris School of Physics and Chemistry. Dr. Bertrand Goldschmidt is one of them. He has been my boss for 20 years as head of the International Relations Division of the French Atomic Energy Commission. Since his retirement, early 70s, he has become the unofficial historian of the development of nuclear energy in my country. He used to remember the exciting atmosphere and the rigorous working conditions in the lab. He was a chemist, and as you know, chemists like to characterize substances by color, smell, and sometimes taste. He told us that he and the other at this time used to assess the smell of the solution by breathing the vapors, then dipping a finger into the solutions and licking it. And I would remember that Goldschmidt is the man who separated the first milligrams of plutonium in France. He is today 80, doing well, and in a very good shape. Nevertheless, I would not recommend today his methods. Marie and Pierre were also the head of a dynasty of distinguished scientists. Their daughter Irene, who married Frédéric Joliot, who was also a great scientist and became the first High Commissioner of the French Atomic Energy Commission. Irene was also a Nobel Prize in physics. And a daughter from Irene and Fred Joliot-Curie, Helen, who married the grandson of another great scientist, Paul Langevin, is herself a renowned researcher at the French National Science Research Center. Thanks to Marie Curie, who discovered the radium and the polonium, opening thus widely the doors to the study of the atom, and thanks to Irene and Fred Joliot-Curie, who discovered the nuclear fission, the uses of nuclear energy could be developed. They have led to important applications either to defense or to peaceful purposes in a number of fields. One of them is power production, upon which this country relies up to 21%, and my country up to more than 75% of total power generation. But let me come back a little to the French-Polish relations in the field of science to tell you that Marie Curie's case, if the greatest, is not an isolated one. Another renowned scientist, Lev Kovarsky, was one of the fathers of nuclear reactor design and technology before World War II, and he contributed mightily to the design of the Canadian heavy water CANDU type of reactors, as well as to the construction of the first French zero-power reactor, Zoe, in 1948. And more recently, George Charpak was awarded this year, in 1992, the Physics Nobel Prize. He had arrived in France from his native Poland at age 7 and became a French national in his late 20s. I would like now to conclude by saying that the people from Poland and from France are proud of Marie Curie, Marie Sklodowska-Curie. She embodies the intelligence, courage, dedication, character, and modesty that make great personalities. Second, women around the world are proud of her because without any behavior of gender warfare, she has demonstrated that female, without sacrificing on their feminine specific qualities and merits, can succeed in any field, even the one that for a very long time seemed to be exclusive to men. Above all, I would say that the whole humanity is proud of Marie Curie because she was a great scientist, of course, but also a great wife and a great mother. In a few words, she was a great lady. But we must remember that even more than a woman of science, she became a great scientist, period. In the name of my ambassador to the US, Jacques Andriani, I want to thank you all very much for the special recognition of her talents and merits by the National Atomic Museum of Albuquerque. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. de Galasus, although I feel I know him well enough now to call him by his first name. We have another wonderful speaker, and I feel like another friend. We all had dinner together last night, and he's very, very interesting. As you know, Madame Curie was born in Poland, and with us today, representing her birthplace, is the Vice Consul of the newly opened Polish Consulate in Los Angeles, Mr. Wojciech Siewierski. Did I get that right, Wojciech?
That's quite right.
See, now I made up for not saying Sklodowska earlier, and I do apologize. Anyway,
Perfect pronunciation.
thank you. Thank you. Anyway, Mr. Siewierski received his BA and MA at the University of Warsaw. He also studied at the Polish State Film and Television School in Lodz, Poland. Mr. Siewierski is an author and book and film critic. Would you please join me in welcoming him to the podium?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a true pleasure to be here. I have a pleasure and the privilege to represent a new consulate of New Poland It's something significant about me being invited here. Only a few years ago, it would have been impossible because of obvious reasons. This was a different Poland. We had a country, as I said yesterday at Rotary Club, we had a country of so-called socialist democracy. Notice this adjective, socialist. Now we have a country of democracy. There was a current joke in Poland. What was the difference between socialist democracy and democracy? The answer to it was that the difference was about the same as a difference between a chair and an electric chair. So now we have, we are proud and happy to say that we have a true democracy, and we have very new and very good relations with the government of the United States. So thank you very much again for inviting me here. I promised Mr. Siwiński that I will not take much of your time. However, let me tell you that Madame Curie was not only one of the most outstanding women in Polish and French history, but she was one of the most outstanding women at all. She was impersonification of women liberation movement, and she surpassed such famous names as Darwin, Röntgen, and her achievements added to theirs. And let me share the opinion of Mr. Congressman that all the human problems will be solved with the help of knowledge. What is very important for the Polish community here is that Madame Curie Skłodowska never lost her contact with Poland. She founded a Radium Institute, and she is also very well remembered in Poland nowadays. I know that there has been a tremendous amount of work put into preparation of this exhibit, and I would like to thank everyone in the name of the Polish Consulate and convey the best wishes and thanks of the Consul General in Los Angeles. Thank you.
Thank you, Wojciech. Our next speaker is going to tell us even more about Madame Curie. He's our keynote speaker for today, and is Dr. Robert Wojnicki. Dr. Wojnicki is an historian, author, educator, and radio and TV personality. He wrote a book on the life and work of Madame Curie, and that book is entitled Madame Curie, Daughter of Poland. Dr. Wojnicki was born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but he spent the majority of his adult life in Arizona. He received a BA and MA in philosophy from St. Mary's University in Baltimore, Maryland. He received a second MA degree in history from the University of Michigan. He was awarded a PhD in history at the University of Madrid in Spain. He has completed extensive postdoctoral work at universities all over the world. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Wojnicki.
Johnny, is this being recorded? Because
Yes.
I don't need this.
It is.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I wish to greet you this morning, and I want to thank the administration of this museum for welcoming me here. And it's a great pleasure to come all the way from sunny Arizona to snowy Albuquerque. I had the privilege and the honor to go to Poland in 1980, 1981, to write a book about Madame Curie. I was sent there by the Kosciuszko Foundation out of New York. And the purpose of my journey there was to tell the world, I suppose, that Madame Curie is not French, that she is Polish. And the book was published in 1983, and I happen to have some with me. So the name of the book was Madame Curie, Daughter of Poland. Now, I went there in 1980, and I stayed there through the year of 1981. That was the year of solidarity. I saw the whole thing as it broke out under Lech Wałęsa. When I went there, I was only about 5'7". I was not very tall. But the Polish food, the Polish beer, and just the atmosphere made me grow to be 6'8", which I am today. So if there's anybody here that would like to get some stature, they can go to Poland. Now, Poland is famous for its scientists, for its biologists, and also for its physics people. Now, I came here to tell you that Poland has developed a pill, and I brought one with me, and if you swallow this pill, you'll be able to speak Polish immediately. There's no charge for this pill, and if you come to see me after my so-called lecture, I will give you one of these pills, and you can speak Polish forever, even in Congress. Well, let me tell you about the pearl of the Polish nation, and I'm speaking now on behalf of all the Poles in America, that we are very, very proud of this museum. It means something to us. Madame Curie is one of our real big shining stars. Poland has many shining stars, among whom I might mention is Chopin, Paderewski, the great pianist, Pope John, Raymond, who won a very famous Nobel Prize. Sienkiewicz also won a Nobel Prize. And we have many Poles who have distinguished themselves, including Lech Wałęsa, the present president of Poland. But among all of them, probably the one who shines the farthest and has obtained world recognition is Madame Curie. Now, I just came back from China. I was teaching in China for the past 4 years. I was teaching at the University of Beijing. And in China, she is a big hero. I did not know this. In fact, they invited me to come to lecture on Madame Curie. This is what they think of Madame Curie. There are many statues of her in China. And in the Museum of Sciences in Beijing, China, there's a huge picture, even bigger than the one out here, in her honor. So she has received international fame. She has received something like 124 honorable doctorate degrees and certificates. And she and Pierre Curie, when he was still alive, wrote and published some 32 theses in science. This great lady was born in 1867 in Warsaw. At that time, Warsaw was under the domination of the Russians. There really was no Poland. Poland had been divided during the history at least 3 times. At one time, you must remember that Poland was the #1 country in all of Europe. So there are many Poles that we pay tribute to, but certainly to the Polish people, Madame Curie stands out far above many of the great Poles that have come from that rather oppressed nation. This year, as you know, is the year of the woman in America. Is there any other great woman in the world that can match the accomplishments of Madame Curie? I've done extensive research on her life, and I've come here to tell you that there is no other woman in the whole world's history as famous as Madame Curie. Nobody has ever done as well as she has in terms of a contribution to world science and to the betterment of the world itself. Born in Warsaw of a rather modest family, she belonged to a family that were teachers, and they had a teaching boarding home where she grew up in this great city of Warsaw. Her father was a teacher, her mother was a teacher. And that's how they made their living. She had an older sister who died early in life, and eventually, in a very short time, her mother also died of TB. This had a tremendous impact on Madame Curie for the rest of her life. She could not understand why God would take two precious souls from her family. It was a very close family, and it remained a very close family throughout her life. She was Polish from the day she was born to the day she died. Even when she would lecture and when she'd do research or whatever she was doing, when it came to numbers and doing numbers, she always counted in Polish. She hated to leave her native land, but she had to because the University of Warsaw would not allow any woman to advance in their education. They could not get any degrees at all from the University of Warsaw. And most of them tried to get to Paris somehow, and that's what she tried to do. But while in Poland, she made a pact with her sister, who was 2 years older. And the plan was this, that Bronisława, the older sister, was to go to Paris, to the University of Sorbonne, which is one of the great universities of the world, and still is. And Bronisława then would go, and Maria would stay home and act as a tutor in many families throughout Poland, raising money to help support Bronisława in Paris. And of course, her father also would contribute some money from his teaching. So Bronisława did go to Paris, to the University of Sorbonne, and became a rather well-known medical doctor, as did her brother, Joseph, who was able and allowed by Tsarist Russia to attend the University of Warsaw. So there are two medical doctors in the family. Now, when Bronisława finished her time in Paris and became a medical doctor, then Maria was given her chance. Bronisława married a doctor, a fellow doctor, and they had a fairly good income so they could support Madame Curie. The only real education Madame Curie had before she left for Paris was that she was an outstanding student in high school. In fact, she received a gold medal, which is one of the big honors in France at that time. She also attended what we call the Flying University, which was a university in the dark shadows of apartments, in the cellars, any place where it was removed from the Tsarist regime that governed Warsaw, because women were not allowed to go to any higher stage of learning at that time in Warsaw. So they had what they call the Flying University. And it was usually held in some very, very, very hidden place. And if they saw anybody coming to perhaps interfere with their lectures, then they flew out of it. And it was called then a Flying University. So women were considered second and third class people at that time. And this left an imprint on Madame Curie because she went on for the rest of her life to tell women to raise up themselves, get out of the kitchen, and go and do your thing. Now, Madame Curie arrived in Paris in 1891. She was poor, really, because they didn't really have that much money. Bronisława was making some money, but doctors were not too well paid, as they are now. But she got a ticket on the train going to Paris, and this ticket only allowed her to stand up on the train. And that's a long ride from Warsaw to Paris. So she brought a chair with her, and she sat on that chair for some 35 hours. Arriving in Paris, stupefied by the grandeur of the whole city. She had never really been outside of the country of Poland. Now, she became a student immediately and lived the life of a hermit. She studied day and night. She gradually obtained 2 master's degrees. And mind you, the lectures were in French, they were not in Polish. And any of you who have had the problem of coming to a foreign country and learning the language and then attending lectures, that's a real accomplishment. She was later in her life to get a doctor's degree and to become chairman of her department at the Sorbonne University, which is one of the finest universities in the world. A great accomplishment for a woman at that time. A tremendous achievement. Now, a few years later, she married Pierre Curie. He was, of course, born in Paris, but he came from a family of scientists. His brother, as well as himself, at that time, were very well-known scientists in France. His father was a medical doctor and almost a world-known specialist in TB. So Madame Curie rose, you might say, in social stature when she married into the Curie family. Their marriage was a very happy one. Pierre was 11 years older than Madame Curie. And they spend their time in a 3-bedroom apartment, very small, and they were so dedicated to science, working together and publishing, that they didn't even want to have furniture in the house because they didn't want anybody to come to visit them. They didn't have time to talk to people. Now that's what you call dedication. And it's the same type of dedication that we have in our Congress. Now, they had 2 children now. Irene, who was the oldest, and she was not what you would call a good-looking gal. And then there was Eva. Eva was good-looking. And they were 2 different types in terms of their capacities for careers. Irene became a scientist much like her mother, and later won a Nobel Prize. So there were 3 Nobel Prizes in the Curie family. Eva was a very good-looking gal and became a noted pianist, musician, and lecturer, as well as a writer. And she traveled throughout Europe giving piano concerts. She lived with her mother almost during her whole life because Eva, the youngest daughter, never married until she was 49. Irene married a scientist, and they had 2 children, and they are very well known in France today, as was mentioned before. But Eva was highly spirited, and both ladies, Irene and Eva, made a great name for themselves. For example, when Irene died in 1956, she had one of the biggest funerals that France ever saw. Eva had international fame because of her writings. Her book was the bestseller in 23 countries. And when de Gaulle left France to escape to London, at his side was Eva Curie. So both ladies were almost internationally known. Now, the first Nobel Prize was awarded in 1903 because Madame Curie and Pierre found 2 elements, 2 properties. One was polonium, the other one was radium. Polonium was named after the great country of Poland. She became the world's famous scientist in the field of radioactivity. Indirectly, her findings and Pierre's findings were to lead to the establishment and the founding of the atomic and nuclear age. So they were awarded then their first Nobel Prize in 1903, but because Madame Curie was not too strong, and by the way, throughout her life, she never enjoyed real good health, she then went to Stockholm, Sweden, 2 years later to receive her award, and Pierre went with her. Now, there was a lot of talk, and there still is, does nuclear energy help the world? And atomic energy, does it help, or does it perhaps create huge warfare problems? This controversy still goes on. But at that conference in Stockholm, Pierre Curie got up and he spoke to the world and he said, I can foresee that someday this tremendous invention, this radioactivity, in the hands of criminals could be a disaster to the world. But he says, I am here today to tell you that radioactivity and radium will do more good than harm. He was a brilliant man. He had never gone as a student to any university. He was tutored privately. And already, way back in 1903, he could see the possibilities that this tremendous atomic energy and radium in the hands of a criminal could be a disaster. That's how bright he was. He could foresee things of the future. Now, shortly after they came back to France, something terrible happened. Excuse me, just a minute. That's better than Polish beer. A disaster struck the Curie family because one day in Paris, Pierre Curie was crossing one of the main streets. It was raining. Like all scientists and professors, as they walk the streets many times, their minds are far away. They have that distant look. And he was crossing a very busy street. It was raining hard. He was not paying attention. And he took his cape and he swung it over his face like this. And he could not see what was coming to the right of him. And it was a big wagon with many horses. And it struck him. Not only did it strike him, and he fell to the ground, but the wheels turned right over his head. And of course, he died instantaneously. Now, this was a terrible blow, obviously, to Maria, to the family, and the world lost a magnificent scientist, a wonderful family man, a great leader among scientists. Now, Madame Curie then was to live the life of a widow for the rest of her life. She never married, but she probably was the most eligible woman for marriage in all of France. And she had many suitors, but she said no. So she spent the rest of her life doing research, writing, and as a full professor at the University of Sorbonne. Totally dedicated to her work, to her family, and to the memory of her beloved husband, because that was a very happy marriage. Many times they would go bicycling through the woods of Paris and through the woods of France. They led a very quiet life, although many famous scientists came to visit them. And of course, they were world famous. So Madame Curie stayed at home, and from time to time she would attend international seminars in science. She gradually became a very close friend of Einstein because he was always at these meetings. And I have a postcard here that I have that will show you a picture of a number of scientists here in Belgium, and she would be the only woman sitting among all these men, wherever she went, and she went worldwide to all these meetings. She came to the United States twice, once under President Harding, and the next time under President Hoover. Both times she stayed in the White House. Now that's a rare, shall we say, treat. Was highly honored by many universities here, given all kinds of doctorate degrees. And to my home state, she came to Arizona to see the Grand Canyon. And we like to tell everybody in the world the Grand Canyon is famous, but Madame Curie is more famous. So Madame Curie was a very shy woman. She never was haughty or proud. She would be about the last one in a group to speak and would never speak unless she was spoken to. She was so shy that she was almost timid. She had piercing eyes, a very good-looking woman, and had a host of friends. She took care of her children with great devotion, so she was an outstanding mother, outstanding scientist, and a brilliant human being. She had a great distaste for money. She never sought any implementation of any type of contracts to get patents on her inventions. Never. She gave all this to her fellow man. Now, during the First World War, she made perhaps one of the greatest contributions that any woman has ever made. She got herself these little Curie cars. They're something like little kitty cat cars. And she put her instruments on there, X-ray and so forth, went within 20 feet of the lines where they were fighting, with about 115 nurses that she trained, and they claim that she saved approximately 1 million lives, plus all the millions since that time that she has saved through radioactivity and X-ray. There's never been a woman that has been able to do this. Never been a person probably that has done anything like this. And for all this, she never even got a medal from the French government. And it got to be where the French government felt so indebted to her that in her later part of her life, she was poor. When she was 50, she had no money, really. So the French government stepped in and told her, even though she didn't want this, that we're going to give you and your daughters a pension for the rest of your life. That is the core, the bottom line of what the French government thought of Madame Curie. Now, she spent so much time with her mother that when she wrote this book, telling about the biography of her mother, it did sell very, very well. Now, I had the privilege, and perhaps one of the greatest privileges of my life, to go to New York and spend 3 hours with Eva Curie before I wrote this book. There was just the two of us in her dining room for approximately 3 hours. I could ask her anything I wanted to. Now let me summarize very briefly what she told me about her mother. She told me that she had scabs on her fingers all the time because this radioactivity was bothering the skin on her hands. She was ill practically all her life from this X-ray and atomic flashes that would irradiate from the materials that she worked with. She was never well. She eventually died of leukemia from her work. She was a martyr. She did not have very good eyesight. She had 3 operations on her eyes. Towards the end, in 1934, she was almost blind. But she continued to lecture, and somehow she had some very large notes in front of her so that she could see a little bit. She hated noise. She didn't like noise. And her daughter was a swinging young lady and had a lot of noise, particularly piano that she played all the time. She often scoffed at her daughter, as all the mothers do today, when they have all these new dresses and sometimes not hardly any dresses at all. And she often criticized her young daughter, Eva, that she used cosmetics and all the wonderful things that young ladies have in their arsenals. She also never smoked or drank. She did take a sip of wine every so often. She read very extensively, not only books in science, but everything she could get her hands on. She loved new ideas. So she was one of those rare scientists that stepped out of her field and knew many things about many things. She was non-political. She was never a Marxist, although her son-in-law, the husband who married Irene, was a very, very staunch communist. She used to love to walk in the woods, and Eva told me that she would sit on the floor with her, and she'd have books all around her in the living room, and she'd work there for hours with Eva doing her thing. Eva told me that she never realized how great her mother was. You know, this was Mama. And I'm sure all of your sons and daughters don't realize how famous you people are. Because there's something in children that they somehow never always recognize the wonderful things that parents do for them. I think she probably had more influence on young scientists than anybody at that time. She harbored a number of scientists. She had something like 40 of them working for her, and always a number of them from Poland, and she paid the airfare, no airfare, the train ticket for almost all of them. And even as a tutor, when she lived in some very nice homes, many of the poor people, the little children, would knock on the door for food, and she'd give them food. So she was never a person that was cold or arrogant. And Eva told me that she herself, along with Irene, had a certain great responsibility to fulfill the promise and the expectations of 2 girls who are, you might say, the daughters of the mother of atomic and nuclear energy. She said that she was very upset when they told her, as well, sometimes appeared among her critics, that she was cold and arrogant, political, and sometimes not very cooperative. And she said that's not true. Her mother was not a political person. And also, incidentally, her mother left the Catholic Church. The death of her mother and her sister at an early age had a tremendous impact on her. She lived at a time in France when Voltaire and anti-clericalism was rampant. She never attended the Catholic Church, had never had her children baptized, and died without any church services. She became an atheist, as was Pierre. And sometimes that's kind of rare for a Pole, because most Poles are very devoted to the Catholic Church. She lived then to the year 1934, She became seriously ill in Paris, and they found a hospital in the south of France because they thought she had TB. But actually, she had a cancer of the blood, leukemia. At that time, they didn't know very much about leukemia, nor what X-rays can do to the human body. So she died peacefully. Both daughters were there, although Irene arrived a little late. She was almost dead by the time Irene got there. She's buried in France in a very small cemetery, and beneath her is Pierre. And I close this morning with a reference from my book. It's an excerpt written in 1934, the day that she died. This excerpt appeared in the city of Vilna, which is in the Soviet Union. It appeared 2 days after she died. And I'm going to quote to you what the paper said about her. The great book of heroic lives acquired yet another epilogue. The chapter of this noble life closed with the black borders of death. Thousands of obituaries are appearing in newspapers around the world. The great host of biographers of this great personage are perhaps already rounding off their research with eloquent epitaphs, completing the balance sheet of her activity. Even among heroes, one cannot find many who radiate such great activity with such tremendous unselfishness. Work, 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 nearly to the last. This was her great gift to mankind. It was for France, her second fatherland, and for Poland, her first. And finally, Einstein, who was a very close friend, and they claim that Madame Curie was the only one who could understand Einstein. And they were very good friends. At one time, they went to Switzerland together with the children and had a wonderful time in the woods and what have you. Einstein said this about her: Maria Curie is, of all celebrated beings, the only one whom fame has not corrupted. And I thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Woznicki. We appreciated that talk. He's given you a great introduction to the exhibit, which is outside, just outside the door. If you can't miss it. Anyway, we have food and music for you. But before you go outside, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Helios String Quartet, specifically to mention the names of the members. They volunteered to do this for us for absolutely no fee. Mr. Krzysztof Zinowski, he's on the violin, and he's from Poland. Jonathan Armurden plays second violin, and he was born in the United States. We have Willie Sucre on the viola, and he's from Bolivia. And then finally, a name that I can pronounce, Adam Gonzalez. He's on the cello, and he's born in the USA. So I hope you all do stay and eat and drink. But in closing, I'd like to first say, Mr. Culpepper, do you have anything you'd like to say? Okay, I want to thank certainly Congressman Schiff for being here, Kevin Murphy, of course, Teo.
I named my son Peter after Pierre Curie.
Did you all, I guess you didn't hear that. Mrs. Abo would like to say that she named her son after Pierre Curie. So she had forgotten to tell you all that. And of course, Jack and Christina Savinsky, Mr. D. Galasos, Mr. Shevyersky. I'm getting better. Okay. And Dr. Woznicki. Thank you, one and all, and please, we appreciate all of you attending, and do stay and have lunch with us. Thank you.